everyone. This week on Food Science, we have a very exciting recipe. We will be making ricotta cheese.
Welcome to this week's episode of Food Science, where we'll be making ricotta cheese. This is probably going to be part one of at least 2 videos we do on making cheese, the next one being mozzarella, but we thought ricotta would be a good introduction.
The basic science that we're using to make our cheese today, or the basic understanding of science that you need to have for cheese, is that the process of making cheese involves breaking down the major protein in milk, which is known as casein. Quick little plug here. We actually talked about casein in a previous episode, the eggnog making episode, and something that we had to keep in mind while making eggnog we are doing intentionally in the process of making cheese, which is this process of breaking down casein and then restructuring it into curds, which you don't want in eggnog, but is actually what you use to make cheese out of.
Right, so on that note, the ingredients that you're using are going to be important today, as well as the supplies, which Rachel's going to talk about in just a little bit. So you're going to want to make sure you're using whole milk. The higher fat content is helpful. And then some sort of acid actually helps the casein to break down. So in this case, we're using actually citric acid from a kit that we bought, but you could also use a lot of common household items such as lemon juice or vinegar.
So if you look up recipes to make ricotta cheese online, a lot of these other recipes for making from home involve using something, like lemon juice. The other things that are really important to keep in mind when making cheese are the supplies that you're using. Because the process involves breaking things down and remaking them, you have to use sort of particular items. The first thing, again, about the milk, she talked about how using whole milk is much better. You also want to make sure not to use ultra pasteurized milk, which is very common in grocery stores. So you have to kind of be careful and keep your eye out for normal pasteurized milk. And the reason why this is because ultra pasteurized milk, the process of doing this ultra pasteurization, heats the milk to such a high heat that it actually completely denatures all of the casein proteins in the milk. And when they get denatured, it just means they're completely unfolded, completely broken apart, and it means it's impossible for them to restructure into curds. So if you accidentally buy ultra pasteurized milk and try to make cheese from it, you won't get any curds at all, which is sad. So make sure you keep an eye out for that. The second important thing to keep in mind is the kind of pots and sort of tools that you use. So you want to make sure you're using stainless steel, enamel coated, or glass pots or tools. And the reason for this is that if you use something like cast iron or aluminum, those don't have a coating on them or any sort of sealant that's supposed to prevent them from getting corroded by what you're adding, and the citric acid component that we're using is very, very corrosive. So if you use something like aluminum or cast iron, that citric acid is actually going to react with the pot that you're using and incorporate metal into the cheese,
right?
Which isn't going to taste very good.
And no one wants metallic cheese, because that probably just isn't what you're going for.
Yeah, but if you have like a huge pot, those often more times than not are stainless steel, but you just got to make sure and check before you begin. Now, let's get started.
Let's make some cheese. One more note, I guess our recipe makes about 1.5 pounds of cheese if you use an entire gallon. That's kind of the ratio. For this, we halved it. That's actually because we did a practice run. This is definitely something that's timing dependent, so if you need to, give it a couple tries before it works, then that's fine.
So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take our citric acid and dissolve it in water. And while I'm doing that, Camille is going to be adding the whole milk to the pot, and then we will be mixing the citric acid solution into the milk.
Now that we've mixed our milk and citric acid, you're going to heat that on a medium-low heat and let it just heat very slowly until it hits about 185, and the reason for that being?
So the casein in milk is actually very, very stable, so stable that it will not fall apart even at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason for that is that there are these negatively charged portions of sort of the outside of these casein sort of clumps, and you have to heat it to 185 in order for it to actually start to break apart. And so during this process, while we're heating it very gradually because we don't want the milk to boil or to stick or to burn. And while this is happening, the casein proteins are breaking apart. So periodically, we're going to check the temperature with our little thermometer. and keep track of it until it hits 185.
Yeah. Another thing that's important, you don't want a skin to form on top of your milk, because you want the clumps to be able to like rise to the top without that on it. And so if you see that starting to happen, even if it's not time for you to give it a full stir, you can just like gently break that up.
Yeah, we recommend stirring it about once every 2 minutes.
Yes, any more and you prevent the reaction from occurring.
Yep. So once the temperature reaches 185, which is the temperature at which the casein will completely denature from the whey in the solution, we're actually going to let it sit for a minute at this temperature so that it can continue to separate. And after that, we will take it off of the heat.
After you let it sit for a minute, take it off of the heat, cover it, and then you're going to let it sit for 15 more minutes. And this is because...
So while it's sitting, now that the whey and the casein are completely separated from one another, we're going to get the formation of these curds. And by letting it sit without heating it with the citric acid, that citric acid actually creates a very inhospitable environment for the protein, which kind of, I use this term, but it's whatever, not scientific, scares the protein, sort of, and they all clump together to try and stay more stable. And this is the formation of curds that we get from the citric acid.
Thank you so much for joining us for this week's episode of Food Science. We really enjoyed making ricotta cheese with you. Tune in some future week, maybe in 2 weeks, maybe a little bit after that, for us making mozzarella. And as always,
do not forget, if you like us, to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and of course, subscribe. Thank you guys!
Thanks so much!